So I'm going to move on to the B preface. The B preface has actually a surprising amount of things that I just couldn't even penetrate. And I've watched a few videos related to the B preface and read some secondary materials related to it, but still found myself kind of perplexed by the specific language that Kant uses. So I wanted to kind of march through what Kant does in the B preface, but also stop at certain points where I found language that I didn't really understand and kind of work my way through it, kind of just in real time. I've done it before when I was typing up my notes, and I think I kind of understand what he's saying, but most of the materials that I've read are kind of just an overview, and I can't find anything that necessarily gets into the specific language that I have an issue with, so I'm just going to try to do that today. So it might be kind of a longer video, and it might be a fair amount of reading and me kind of reacting / thinking through stuff as we go. So Kant starts out the B preface. So the B preface was the preface to the second edition. It was written approximately 10 years after the first edition. And it's called the B preface because Kant rewrote the entire preface for the critique. And he starts out the B preface by talking about logic. And he claims that logic has been pretty successful, and it hasn't really changed since Aristotle, which I'm not really... I've read and heard that that might be a little overstated, but I'm not really equipped to make that determination. But Kant talks about why logic has been successful, and he states that logic should in this respect have been so successful is due entirely to its limitations, whereby it has not only the right, but also the duty to abstract from all objects of knowledge and their differences, so that the understanding has to deal with nothing beyond itself and its own form. So I think in the grand scheme of things, like this is pretty important, right? Because this is effectively where Kant wants to start with his critique of pure reason, like the actual goal of his book. So he wants to start, as we talked about in the A preface discussion, he wants to start by figuring out a priori what we can know about experience on the one hand and the understanding on the other hand. And so it's interesting that he talks about logic to start here, which effectively doesn't require any experience, is what he's saying, and claims that's why it's been successful. But he also points out something following this, where he talks about logic running into issues. He states, "It was far more difficult, of course, for reason to enter on the secure course of science." Is this pages later? No. So this follows the quote that I just made. He states, "It was far more difficult, of course, for reason to enter on the secure course of science, considering that it has to deal not with itself alone, but also with objects." And so Kant's really talking about two different things here. And he goes on to talk about it a little more concretely. Kant claims that, at least my understanding, is that mathematics is essentially kind of pure logic. He gives the example of the isosceles triangle. And effectively says, well, somebody who was figuring out the properties of a triangle, they can just kind of in their mind's eye picture a triangle, and they don't necessarily have to go find a triangle in the world and observe it and run a bunch of tests on it. They can kind of just use their understanding and their mind and some reason, and they can figure out a bunch of stuff about triangles and geometry, mathematics, stuff like that. Physics, which he refers to as kind of the science part of this, physics has a bit of a problem with that. Well, at least it's more involved, right? You can't just think of an object falling and figure out how it's going to fall. You have to go out and you have to drop a bunch of stuff and time it and observe it, calculate mass and drag and whatever else. So already, even though, math has made tremendous discoveries, and Kant believes that it's like on the path to being, or is actually, a subject that is on much more terra firma than metaphysics is, and as is science. But he points out that science has... So first of all, he points out that mathematics relies completely on logic. And I think it's important because, his description of what he's going to do in the Critique of Pure Reason is effectively he's going to use a priori logic and reasoning and principles, separate and apart from experience, to tell us what reason can tell us about experience on the one hand and the understanding on the other hand. And it sounds a lot like, some of that might sound a lot like mathematics in this sense. Like, you think about, what experience we have. He's not able to incorporate experience into it because he's trying to figure out things a priori. So and maybe it's a lot like logic, this kind of task that he's undertaking. But science requires a little more. It requires input from the world in considering the objects within the world and how they function. But Kant can't escape that, right? Because, and we've already kind of talked about this in the Preface, because he can say a priori things about objects in the world. He can also say a priori things about our understanding. But the real rub, and what Kant is, so well known for, is like the interaction of those two things. And so eventually, I think Kant has to come to do what he, describes science doing here, as opposed to mathematics. Like using that reason, or using the objects in the world, plus the reason that you have, to actually kind of pull everything together and figure out something about our human experience. And so he gives a few examples. The first one is with mathematics. He states, the first man who demonstrated the properties of the isosceles triangle, be he Thales or another, had his eyes opened, for he found that he did not have to investigate what he saw in the figure, or in the mere concept of that figure, and thereby learn its properties, but that he had to achieve his knowledge by constructions, by means of what he himself, according to concepts, had a priori placed into that figure. And I think that sounds a lot like, that to me just sounds like what Kant is trying to do, kind of right off the rip here. Again, he eventually is going to bring everything together, but that's kind of like where he starts. And, he goes on to say that he wants to, math and science created this, like, had certain moments in their history where, these kind of revolutionary moments where things were figured out, principles were established, and it was through reasoning and logic, and then everything has kind of been building from there, it kind of feels. And Kant is kind of describing what he's doing as like creating that revolutionary moment for metaphysics. That's what he wants to do. And he refers to it as his Copernican revolution. And the Copernican revolution, I know it's been written about a lot, and people certainly understand it a lot better than I do. But effectively, it is the idea that prior to Kant, everybody was kind of approaching the world, the objects in the world, and trying to figure out what we could know about them and what they told us about experience. And trying to figure out like how our cognition could like receive these things relatively passively. And, a lot of different philosophers kind of describe the characteristics of things in the world and our ability to kind of perceive them and interact with them. For example, like Locke had his primary and secondary substances, where the primary was kind of like the size, length, width of things, and then secondary subjects or secondary characteristics were color, taste, stuff like that. That's kind of subjective. It's kind of an input that we can experience, but isn't necessarily in the thing itself. And Kant totally kind of rejects this. And I actually I think it's most helpfully put by the Yovel text, which I'll have in the description. I thought he described it really well. The Kantian revolution abolishes the object's metaphysical independence and makes it dependent on the structure of human knowledge. The structure of the object, meaning the empirical object, the only one we know, is derived a priori, free of sense experience, from the human understanding, intellect, that connects a multitude of sensible items into a unity. And the modes of this unification are drawn from the primordial unity of the I think. And so that gets into a lot of concepts that we haven't gotten to so far. But the idea is, until Kant, to bring this back to Copernicus, until Kant, the object was the center of the universe. We tried to figure out what we could know about it and how that affected our understanding and our experience. Like, what can that object, as we experience, tell us about it? But what Kant wants to do is say, well, that was kind of wrong-headed. We bring our experience to the object, and we are the reason that the object is able to present itself to us. And so the object is really nothing without connecting its appearance, which is just kind of what we are able to experience of it, with an actual being that is able to experience it. And so let me read from Kant specifically, because I think it's helpful to kind of understand maybe what he's doing before actually reading what he said. So he states, "We want to imitate revolutionary leaps that were made by math and science. Hitherto it has been supposed that all our knowledge must conform to its objects. But all attempts to establish something about them a priori by means of concepts, and thus to expand our knowledge, have on this supposition come to nothing. We should therefore attempt to tackle the tasks of metaphysics more successfully by assuming that the objects must conform to our knowledge. This would better agree with the required possibility of an a priori knowledge of objects. On that would settle something about them before they are given to us." And so, just to pause really quick, part of what is insanely important to Kant is like the possibility of a priori knowledge about the world, right? If a priori knowledge about the world is possible, then it's something within us, right? So just to break it down, a priori knowledge about the world is something that we know about our experience in the world, of the objects in the world, before we experience it. And therefore, just kind of, based on reason, there must be something that we are ourselves bringing to the world, regardless of the appearance that it presents to us. Because otherwise, we couldn't know anything about it before we experience it. And that's what Kant wants to argue, and that's kind of the point I think he's making there. If we have this a priori stuff to bring to the world, it's kind of wrong-headed to think that we just present ourselves to the world presents itself to us, and we don't kind of bring any knowledge to it in order to, kind of define the world and understand it. So to go on, Kant states, "We are here in a similar situation as Copernicus was at the beginning, unable to proceed satisfactorily in the explanation of motions of the heavenly bodies, on the supposition that the entire collection of the stars turned round the spectator. He tried to see whether he might not have greater success by making the spectator revolve and leaving the stars at rest." So Kant is saying here, every philosopher up until now has put the objects at the center of the universe, and we've tried to figure out what we can know about the objects and what they tell us about themselves and about our experience. And Kant is saying, no, we need to put ourselves at the center of that. And what we bring to that experience will tell us about objects as we experience them. And that's the switch. Kant goes on. A similar experiment may be tried in metaphysics as regards to the intuition of objects. If the intuition had to conform to the constitution of objects, I would not understand how we could know anything of them a priori. But if the object, as object of the senses, conformed to the constitution of our faculty of intuition, I could very well conceive such a possibility. So this is kind of what I was talking about a minute ago. If we are able to know something about objects a priori before we experience them, then it has to be that we bring something to the object, and it must conform to that those ideas, or that faculty of intuition that Kant calls it. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to know anything about it a priori. It just kind of would fall apart. If we aren't able to know anything a priori, that would make sense. We just kind of take the world as it comes. But since Kant is going to argue that he proves we can know stuff about our experience a priori, we have to bring something to it, regardless of what is presented to us. And therefore we have to be active participants in forming our experience of the world. Alright, so Kant continues. As, however, I cannot rest in these intuitions if they are to become knowledge, but have to refer them as representations to something as their objects, and must determine this object through them. I can assume that either the concepts through which I arrive at this determination also conform to the object, and I would again be perplexed about how I can know anything about it a priori, or else that the objects, or what is the same thing, the experience, in which alone they are known, as objects are given to us, conform to those concepts. Alright, so this is where I really have to start slowing down and trying to figure out what the hell Kant is talking about. Okay, and I think he's saying something very similar to what we just discussed. He's just saying it in a way that I just don't get. So I'm gonna take this really slow. Okay, so he says, as, however, I cannot rest in these intuitions if they are to become knowledge. So what he's saying here, so just to stop there, I think what he's saying is, if I have a priori ideas about the world, I can't just, I can't just know them, or I can't have them become knowledge about the world unless I eventually apply that to experience, right? So I have the idea that space and time are kind of the building blocks of the world, and I can think that and kind of reason that, before, like a priori, so before I experience it, but it doesn't really become knowledge until I start talking, like until I open my eyes and go into the world and figure it out, right? I have some object to, apply that to. And this gets to like a really famous quote where I'm not going to try to quote it, but Kant says this pretty eloquently, I think in the first part of the real book after the preface. Okay, so as I cannot rest in these intuitions if they are to become knowledge, but have to refer them as representations to something as their object, okay, and must determine this object through them. Okay, again, so he's saying that these a priori ideas there have to be objects that apply to them to really figure out whether or not they're working, or they're real, or they're true, or they're, actual knowledge. To go on, I can assume either that the concepts which I arrive at this determination also conform to the object. Okay, and so now what he's saying is, if I assume that those a priori concepts that I just talked about conform to the object, I would again be as perplexed about how I can know anything about it a priori. This is where he loses me. Or else that the objects, or what is the same thing, the experience in which they are known as objects given to us, conform to those concepts. And I think what gets me hung up on this is, I think this is where Kant is introducing the idea of objects in themselves and objects as appearances, which are objects as things which we experience. So I think what Kant is saying is that I can take these a priori concepts to the world and to objects within the world, and I have to apply them to objects for them to be true. But if I try to apply them to objects as they are themselves, like objects in themselves, I still don't know anything about them, because that's something we kind of can't know. So he still can't do that. I think that's what he's trying to get at there. Otherwise, I don't know what the fuck he's talking about. Or else the objects, or what is the same thing, the experience in which alone they are known as objects are given to us, conform to these concepts. Okay, I'm going to keep going. I think that's what he means, but I would love for somebody to explain what I'm missing there, because it feels like I'm not positive that that's what he's talking about. Okay, so he continues. In the latter case, so I think what he's referring to here as the latter case is applying the a priori concepts that we come up with to objects in themselves. I recognize an easier solution because experience itself is a kind of knowledge that requires understanding. So I think this is what he's getting at. I think he's getting at the dichotomy between an object in and of itself, like how much do we know things in themselves, as opposed to what Kant is really concerned with. I think he's going to take the position, it's fucking lost. We can't know a thing as it is in and of itself, right? A thing in itself. But we can know appearances. And I think what Kant is eventually going to get to in this, in a couple of paragraphs or maybe a page, is there's those two possibilities. And Kant is going to talk all about, so the appearance of things as I experience them, which takes no position on what they actually are, because, it is just as I experience it, right? But then there's the further thing of the thing in itself. And I think Kant's going to say we can tell a lot of things about the appearance because that's what we're presented with. That's what we know and, can talk about. And then he kind of reserves all of his really, really cool ideas for the thing in itself. I'm being kind of snarky, but this will become more clear when he provides some examples. Okay. In the latter case, I recognize an easier solution because experience itself is a kind of knowledge that requires understanding. And this understanding has its rules, which I must presuppose as existing within me before objects are given to me, and hence a priori. These rules are expressed in a priori concepts to which all objects of experience must necessarily conform, and with which they must agree. Again, objects as we experience them, not objects in and of themselves. So what he's saying is, like, I can have these ideas a priori, and then I can apply it to objects as they appear to me. What he's saying he can't do, even if he knows stuff a priori, is apply it to things in themselves. I think there's a guy with a fucking mic. He continues, for by thus changing our point of view, the possibility of a priori knowledge can well be explained, and, what is still more, the laws which a priori lie at the foundation of nature, as the sum total of objects of experience, may be supplied with satisfactory proofs, neither of which was possible within the procedure hitherto adopted. Okay, so I think this is kind of nailing down, maybe, what I was just talking about. So, essentially by dividing the world into these two possibilities, actual experience and things in themselves, we can tell things about nature because it's our experience. And we can provide proofs about that because that's how we experience it. And by actually trying to figure out nature qua nature, like nature as it actually is, like things as they actually are, things in themselves, we're not able to do that. So up until now, until Kant made this division, it hasn't really been possible for us to, in a satisfactory way, describe the nature of our experience and of things in our world. Okay, I'm okay with that. Meaning, I think I understand that. But there arises from this deduction of our faculty of knowing a priori, as given in the part of the metaphysics, a somewhat startling result, apparently most detrimental to that purpose of metaphysics, which has to be treated in its second part, namely, the impossibility of using this faculty to transcend the limits of possible experience, which is precisely the most essential concern of the science of metaphysics. Okay, so I think what Kant is saying here is this presents us with a problem, with metaphysics in particular. Metaphysics is essentially asking us for things outside of physics, like things, grand things that tell us about the universe that we can't measure or, whatever. And so if Kant is solely relying on things as we experience them, how can he tell us about physics that we don't experience, metaphysics? So that's a problem. Makes sense. He goes on. But here's where he completely loses me. I'll be honest, I read this so many times, but maybe I'll have some sort of come to Jesus moment live on YouTube. Not live, but anyway. But here, we have exactly the experiment which, by disproving the opposite, establishes the truth of the first estimate of our a priori rational knowledge. Okay, so what he's saying is, by showing that we have to talk about appearances only, and that those appearances aren't going to tell us a lot about metaphysics. By showing that, it's actually going to tell us a lot about metaphysics. That is... Okay, I'm just going to start over. But here we have exactly the experiment which, by disproving the opposite, establishes the truth of the first estimate of our a priori rational knowledge. Namely, that it is directed only at appearances, and must leave the thing in itself as real for itself, but unknown to us. Okay, so I get that, and I think we've been talking about that. What I don't understand is the point I just made, which is what I thought Kant was talking about in the previous passage, about this being detrimental to the purpose of metaphysics. Because if we are focusing on appearances and the world as we experience it, how are we going to transcend that experience to actually learn something about metaphysics? But let's keep going, and maybe we'll find out. Okay. For that which necessarily impels us to go beyond the limits of experience and of all appearances is the unconditioned, which reason rightfully and necessarily demands, aside from everything else conditioned, in all things in themselves, so that the series of conditions be completed. So this is the real, this is where he really loses me. I know I said that previously, but okay. For that which necessarily impels us to go beyond the limits of experience, and of all appearances is the unconditioned. Okay, I get that. So if we're trying to transcend experience, we are in appearances, it's going to be something that's completely unconditioned. Could be anything, I guess. Which reason rightfully and necessarily demands. And this is where I go back to the A preface, maybe. Kant began the A preface by effectively saying, reason demands that we know certain things about our experience that we cannot possibly know. So is this reason being a bastard and demanding things, unconditioned knowledge of things in themselves, but we can't get it? Going on. Aside from everything conditioned, in all things in themselves, so that the series of conditions be completed. I'm going to keep going. I'm not 100% sure what he might mean by that. I think what he's saying is we have to know kind of the conditional, like the things we can actually know with reason, and then the unconditional, the things that are separate and apart from transcendent of appearances and our experience, and then kind of reason demands we put all that shit together to know something, which it's impossible. But anyway, Kant continues. If then we find that under the supposition that our empirical knowledge conforms to objects as things in themselves, the unconditioned cannot be thought without contradiction. Okay, so if then we find, under the supposition that our empirical knowledge conforms to objects as things in themselves. Okay, so what he's saying is, if knowledge that we have about the world is we're actually witnessing them and experiencing them and able to see them as things in themselves, as what they actually are, then the unconditioned, that transcendent shit, cannot be thought without contradiction. Okay, because if we're actually experiencing it as a thing in itself and knowing everything about it, there effectively wouldn't be that unconditional knowledge we're talking about, that transcendent knowledge that is needed in order to understand things in themselves. Kant continues, while under the supposition that our representation of things, as they are given to us, does not conform to them as things in themselves, but on the contrary... Hold on. He's lost me. Let's start over. If then we find that under the supposition that our empirical knowledge conforms to objects as things in themselves, the unconditional cannot be thought without contradiction, as I just said, while under the supposition that our representation of things as they are given to us does not conform to them as things in themselves, but, on the contrary, that these objects as appearances conform to our mode of representation, then the contradiction vanishes. Okay, I think I'm there. I think I got it. So, what Kant is saying is, in the first part that I just talked about, I don't want to go over it, repeat myself too many times, but under the supposition that our empirical knowledge conforms to objects as things in themselves, the unconditioned cannot be thought without contradiction. In other words, if we take the position that empirical knowledge conforms to things in themselves, I know that book over there as it is an object in itself, then the unconditioned kind of doesn't make sense to even exist. It's a contradiction, because I already know the thing in itself. I don't need to transcend it to figure it the fuck out. But if we take the position that our representations, like how we experience things, does not conform to the things in themselves, we don't have that same contradiction. Because the book over there is just an appearance to me, and Kant is reserving whatever it is in and of itself as unknowable. That's the unconditioned. So we no longer have that contradiction. Okay, I think that makes sense. And so the contradiction vanishes. And so Kant, as I said way before, he just says it in like such a, I don't know, this ties my brain in a complete knot. So effectively he's setting up two different buckets to put everything into. And it's a little weird to me, but appearances are objects as they are presented to us. So as I experience the world, there's the Dyson right there, and there's a book over there, etc. That's just how it appears to me. I don't know the thing in of itself, like the thing in itself. The weird thing that he does is, okay, so I can, surmise a few things about things in them, about things as they appear to me. But then I'm going to reserve a bunch of judgments and information for things in themselves. Because, well, I can tell you what I can about its appearance, but I can't, nobody knows what's the thing in itself, so maybe it's all these things. And we'll get into some examples, but it's a really confusing way of saying this. Okay. Kant continues. And if we find, therefore, that the unconditioned cannot be encountered in things insofar as we are acquainted with them, insofar as they are given to us, but only in things insofar as we are not acquainted with them, that is, insofar as they are things in themselves, then it becomes apparent that what we at first assumed only for the experiment is well founded. Gotta reread that. And if we find, therefore, that the unconditioned cannot be encountered in things insofar as we are acquainted with them. Okay, so, as we said, if we are not going to experience that transcendent, unconditioned thing in itself as it's presented to us, but only in things insofar as we are not acquainted with them, so the thing in itself we're not acquainted with, that is, insofar as they are things in themselves, then it becomes apparent that what we had first assumed only for the experiment is well founded. So I think the point that Kant is making is, therefore, we can have a priori ideas that we then apply to objects in the world, because we are applying them only to objects as they appear to us and things as we experience them, and therefore those a priori judgments can be valid. If we were to try to do that for things in themselves, since we don't know them and we can't know them without figuring out this unconditioned, transcendent bullshit, we wouldn't be able to do that. The a priori stuff wouldn't be valid. it would just be an idea that's possible. But we can say, Kant thinks, kind of as a matter of fact, that this reasoning that we have a priori about the world is actually knowable for things, at least insofar as we experience them. Okay. Oh, that was exhausting. I still have 2 pages of notes to get through, but I think that's what Kant is going for. And again, I've read a lot about what Kant is doing, and listened to lectures about it, and still I get to this language and I'm like, what the hell is he talking about? So if this is helpful to anybody in the world, or maybe just myself, that's enough. But anybody else, that would be wonderful. Okay, so Kant goes on. This is a few pages later. So I think this previous stuff is like at 1819 of my edition, and this is at page 23 I have in my notes. So this is not, it's connected, but not immediately after what we just read. That space and time are only forms of our sensible intuition, and therefore only conditions of the existence of things, except insofar as an intuition corresponding to these concepts can be given, and consequently, that we cannot have knowledge of any object as a thing in itself, but only insofar as it is an object of sensible intuition, that is, an appearance. All this is proved in the analytical part of the critique. Okay. So this is just a one-sentence, really broad summary of something that Kant proves in the Transcendental Aesthetic. I don't know what he means by analytical part, because isn't this the Transcendental Aesthetic, that space and time are the forms of our sensible intuition? Anyway, Kant is saying here that Kant takes the position, at least, this is my understanding, and I thought it was in the Transcendental Aesthetic, that the two a priori things that we can effectively know about our experience of the world as an appearance, not as the thing in itself, are space and time. Effectively, we have to bring those ideas to our experience, and we can't know anything in experience without those two things. And Kant is saying that this is going to be proved later on in the book. And from this, it does indeed follow that all speculative knowledge of reason is limited to mere objects of experience. But it should be carefully borne in the mind that we must at least be able to think the same objects as things in themselves, though we cannot know them. So this is the part where like Kant is like specifically reserving the existence of things in themselves for him to throw shit into, like a bucket for him to push shit into. And he goes on to talk about, I don't know if I had the examples in our notes, but he effectively says like, well, if I don't believe that my dog lives forever because I just watched it die and that's the experience that I had, well, maybe the thing in of itself, like its soul, actually, as it really is, it lives on forever. That's like kind of a cheeky example, but like he does something like that. Let me see if I can find it. Here, Kant says, I should then not be able to say of one and the same being, for instance, the human soul, that its will is free and at the same time subject to the necessity of nature, that is, not free, without involving a palpable contradiction. So Kant is saying, in the things in themselves world, like that's the only world we have, we couldn't say both of those things are true. That the human soul and its will are free, but also kind of subject to the strictures of like physical nature, right? They're trapped in a body and can't, go over the speed limit, whatever. And then Kant goes on, because I had taken the soul in both proposition and one in the same sense, namely as a thing in general, parentheses, as something in itself, close parentheses, as which, without a preceding critique, I could not but take it, if, however, our criticism were true, and I think what he's saying is we know things things exist in two senses, in teaching us to take an object in two senses, namely either as an appearance or as a thing in itself, and if the deduction of our concepts of the understanding were correct, and the principle of causality applied to things only if taken in the first sense, namely insofar as they are objects of experience, but not to things if taken in the second sense, then, when belonging to appearance and visible action, we can, so in space visible action, we can, without any contradiction, think the same will as necessarily conforming to the law of nature, and hence not free, and yet on the other hand, when belonging to the thing in itself as not subject to the law of nature and therefore free. Okay, so the first thing that comes to mind here is Hume. First of all, I want to plant that flag and come back to it. But again, Kant is making the point that I kind of was chastising him for. Kant's a fucking genius, and I'm just an idiot. I'm not trying to act like I'm smarter than him or something. But effectively, he's like creating this space for these kind of contradictions in the world. And frankly, it seems he's making space for God, right? So we have nature and like all this other stuff, so how do we explain God and things we can't see in metaphysics and all that other stuff? And he's saying, well, we have our experience in the one bucket, but then there's the second bucket, the thing in itself, which we can't know. So I'll describe everything we can in appearance, and then, I don't know what we'll do with the second bucket. But to go back to Hume, I mean, so Hume has this example, or I don't know if he has this example, but like Hume has a lot of issues with causality, right? And Hume's point is, like, we see the billiard balls on the table, and we see them hit each other, and the one billiard ball that's moving causes the other billiard ball to move after it hits it. But we can't see the causation. Like, we can't, we don't know. That's unknowable. We can't experience that. We can't see it. We can't touch it. We can't. So causality is just always up for grabs, and we can never know. All we know is it has happened previously that way, but there's no reason that it has to happen that way. One could easily imagine a world where that billiard ball hits the other billiard ball, and they both just stop. Unless something is a contradiction, it's effectively like not proven for Hume. And so I think Kant is kind of responding to that. It's saying, well, sure, we can't see that, but we have our appearances, right? And we can talk about the appearances, and that's what matters for a lot of different things like science and math and human experience and talking about our experience of the world and stuff, and all the a priori stuff we bring to that. And we can put causality and the things that we can't see in the thing in itself bucket. And, we just can't know it, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist or is something that should just be kind of taken as impossible and undefinable. Okay. Okay, so Kant goes on to kind of say this, I think, and the last sentence is really kind of the upshot, I think. Reason, namely, in order to arrive at these, must employ principles which extend to objects of possible experience, and which, in spite of this, they are applied also to what cannot be an object of experience. Actually always change into an appearance, thus rendering all practical expansion of pure reason impossible. Hence, I had to suspend knowledge in order to make room for belief. In other words, I can't know that the billiard balls running into each other are going to move each other, like for a fact. But it's going to happen. So I have to suspend the fact that I can't know that in and of itself to make room for the belief that based on my experience and based on appearances and everything we can tell about that they will function as they always have functioned. Alright, so Kant has said a ton of different things and kind of set up a pretty interesting structure for everything. So, again, just to summarize very briefly, Kant is concerned with providing an a priori basis for understanding our experience in the world, on the one hand, and our understanding on the other hand. And he's specifically talking about, in the B preface, much more than the A preface, this idea of appearances, which is kind of central to his project. And Kant is really focused on things as we experience them, which whenever Kant says appearance, that's kind of what he's talking about. Not just things as we see them, but things as we experience them. But he's also reserving for himself and humanity, I guess, the possibility that there's a lot of stuff that we think about the world, that we hope for the world, that's kind of unconditional, transcendent information that we've always longed to know. There's still room for that in Kant's universe, in the things in themselves. So everything, God, afterlife, whatever, can exist in this world. We just can't know it. And our attempts to know it previously, they've all failed for a reason. And what Kant wants to do is go back to basics and use reason as... So first of all, putting us in the center of the universe. So the Copernican revolution. So our a priori knowledge of the world is going to effectively shape the world, and not only so this relationship between objects and understanding, it isn't just that our understanding is going to receive objects. Objects are effectively not going to be anything or mean anything without us, nor are we going to be able to make sense of anything or do anything or understand anything without the use of these objects. So they're kind of like completely intertwined and like integral to the other's existence. And so I'm going to close, I think, with a quote from the Yovel text, which will be in the description of every video I have because I'm just reading it, along with a critique of pure reason. He states, "The understanding is a formal, a priori structure that cannot function without the material we acquire from the senses by being passively exposed to them. The senses supply the understanding with a crude element that is not yet a real object, but only the material for it. And the understanding, a spontaneous factor, must order and shape this material according to its, the understanding's, own a priori modes of operation. And I think that's a really good summary of kind of that interconnectedness and the big picture of what Kant is trying to do and explain in the B preface.